One of the best ways to get the most out of your Sony Alpha camera in terms of its image quality and dynamic range is by shooting in log. And in any modern Sony camera, this is typically going to be S-Log3 and S-Gamma3.Cine, also known as the PP8 picture profile. But in truth, there are a lot of different nuances to shooting log in Sony's cameras, and in fact can be more of a science than art in a lot of different ways. So in this video, we're going to talk about 5 key tips you'll want to keep in mind when shooting S-Log3 in your Sony Alpha camera that should enable you to get the best image possible. And to start, number 1, use Gamma Display Assist. In most of Sony's cameras, when shooting in S-Log3 by default, the image you're going to see on screen is going to be a very flat and dull representation of what it actually should be. And more than anything, this makes it very difficult to actually assess your exposure or whatever the final image is going to look like. Most all of Sony's cameras over a number of years include the Gamma Display Assist feature that, when turned on, allow you to see the image in sort of a Rec. 709-like color grade with proper contrast and saturation that should ultimately help you not just expose the image more so correctly, but allow you to see what it's going to look like when finally graded. In Sony's newer cameras, you can find this by going to the setup menu, going all the way down, in this case, to the display option settings, going over to Gamma Display Assist, turning that on, and then for the Gamma Display Assist type, making sure either the auto setting is selected, meaning that if you're in S-Log3, it'll show the proper LUT on screen for viewing S-Log3 footage, and will do so for other different picture profiles like S-Log2 and HLG, or more explicitly just choosing the S-Log3 option. In this case, I will leave it on auto, and although this is one of those things that doesn't come across in a direct HDMI out from the camera, what you'll see is here in the separate B-roll is that once Gamma Display Assist is turned on, the image that I'm seeing on screen when shooting S-Log3 looks dramatically different and is much more easier to see the final product and just to expose correctly. In truth, if you have a newer Sony camera that lets you load in custom user LUTs, this is yet another way you can ultimately provide for this by applying a LUT on screen. Perhaps that is something I'll show in a separate video later, so let me know if you'd like to see anything on that. But once you have Gamma Display Assist turned on, you'll want to keep in mind the second point, which is number 2, expose to the right, or ETTR. So if we go back to a picture profile like S-Cinetone, you're going to see we have a relatively normally exposed image here, at least in terms of what we're seeing on screen, and based on the multimeter value of 0.0 that we see. If we were to instead shift this back to S-Log3, we might have what looks to be a standard and normally exposed image. However, for S-Log3, it is commonly known that you'll want to usually expose this 1 to 2 stops over what you normally would, say, an in-camera color picture profile. This is to ultimately allow for a cleaner shadow area and noise floor so that in those deeper parts of the image, you're still ending up with a very clean shot, and you'll have more latitude to be able to push and pull this image than you would, say, if you were to expose normally or certainly underexpose that same image. So in our example here with S-Log3, even though we have a 0.0 value here on our multimeter, in an ideal sense, we'd actually want to shoot this brighter to get a cleaner image. So if we were to open up our aperture in this case, you would see we are now at 1 stop overexposed compared to at least where we were and what our multimeter shows. And yes, in the case of assessing metering here, we are just using the default settings that you would see in most Sony cameras in terms of the multimeter. And if you look at the difference between a normally exposed +1 exposure value and a +2 exposure value here, you're going to see the difference between the noise performance and the shadow areas and why folks will typically want to expose to the right in many cases when shooting S-Log3. Of course, if you're leaning to the 2 stops overexposed value for shooting S-Log3, you're going to want to make sure that your multimeter rating is just reading +2 in that sense, and certainly not blinking and going above that, because that would indicate that we are exceeding 2 stops of overexposure and we may be clipping our highlights. But to really know if we're clipping our highlights or not, that is not going to be the best determining factor, which is where number 3 comes in: use zebras. Yes, using zebras when shooting S-Log3 is going to be a big determining factor in helping you assess your exposure, and especially in preventing clipping your highlights, though there's a lot of different takes on this, and there's one method I tend to prefer using that not a lot of people often talk about. So to set my zebras, I'm going to go down to the exposure and color mode, go all the way down to the zebra display setting. First go onto zebra display and make sure that this is turned on, and then for the zebra level, I'm going to set a couple of different things. Here I'm going to use the C2 value to set a custom zebra setting. And in the C2 setting, we're going to want to use the lower limit type rather than, say, the standard and range. In this case, because with the lower limit, we're ultimately only going to show zebras above a certain threshold of exposure, or IRE. And in this case, we're going to want to set that value here to 94+. And this is simply because 94 IRE is the clipping point of S-Log3, so we want to make sure our highlights are below this number and that we're not seeing zebras here, especially when we're exposing to the right. Now again, this is one of those settings that doesn't come across well in an HDMI feed on screen, but as you'll see here, having the zebra set and having this lower limit set to a value of 94 plus means that we're going to be able to assess, even when exposing to the right, when we are too overexposed and we need to dial back or change our exposure so that we are retaining our highlight information. But to also get a clean image and avoid any issues with noise is to also point out number 4, know your ISOs. So simply put, in most Sony cameras over the past number of years, each of these cameras contain some method of a dual ISO circuit that allow for getting clean image and noise performance both at a low or base ISO value and a high ISO value. This number varies considerably across each of Sony's different cameras, and if you're an A7S III, an A7 IV, or an A7R5 owner, I have videos on each of these topics that I will link to above and in the description below that you can check out. When shooting an S-Log3 in any of Sony's cameras, you really are going to want to stick to either this low or base ISO or the high ISO value to get the cleanest image and reduce the amount of noise that you see in that image as much as you can. In the A7R5, as we're demonstrating here, we are actually now at 2500, which is the high ISO value, though I could instead bring this down to 800 to get a slightly different shot, and maybe adjust my exposure slightly to still bring us into some level of exposed to the right, in this case, one stop. In truth, you may be able to go outside these bounds ever so slightly, but that is going to vary camera to camera, and I would definitely be considerate of this and keep in mind those ISO values when you're picking your exposure in camera. And when considering all of those points we've just talked to, we'll still want to think about shooting S-Log3 after the fact and what that looks like. And therefore, number 5, get a grading process. Yes, what does it actually look like to take that flat S-Log3 footage for you and get it into a more standard Rec. 709 looking image? Do you use something like a proper conversion LUT to bring that color space back from S-Log3 and S-Gamut 3.Cine back to Rec. 709? Are you color grading this by hand to try to bring it back? I hope not. Are you using certain LUTs of different types that are meant to respond to different exposure values in terms of how S-Log3 was shot? And more than anything, are you going to be able to take that image that you captured in camera and be able to apply it and color grade it appropriately so it gets a good, solid, consistent look like you would want and expect? Everyone's workflow is ever so slightly different for grading S-Log3, much like it is in terms of shooting it, and so I would definitely make sure you consider the process in post nearly or almost just as much as you do in camera for shooting it. And because I often have trouble sticking to these fixed lists, let's talk about a couple quick additional points. The first of these being bit depth and chroma subsampling. Simply put, if your Sony camera has the ability to shoot 10-bit 422 versus, say, 8-bit 420 in many of Sony's older cameras, you should probably be shooting that with S-Log3. The amount of colors and color information that you get in a 10-bit image versus that of an 8-bit image is vast, and I do mean vast, and this is going to give you a significant amount of additional room to push and pull your image in post than, say, if you only shot it with 8 bits. But if you're curious as to what specific settings I use for this, I go into a lot more detail on this exact topic and many more in my Sony A7R5 photo and video settings tutorial that I will leave a link to above and in the description below. And the second point that I want to really make note of here is, yes, testing. Yes, everything I talked about here, whether gamma display assist, exposing to the right, using zebras, knowing your ISOs, or getting a good grading process, these are all things you really have to truly test out yourself and find your proper workflow for what shooting and exposing S-Log3 will look like. There is truly no one-size-fits-all solution, and this is just what I found works best in capturing S-Log3 in Sony Alpha mirrorless cameras. You may find you have different things you like doing and that work better for you, and in fact, if you do have them, feel free to comment below because I'm certainly curious to hear them. So those are my 5+ tips for shooting S-Log3 in Sony mirrorless cameras. Hopefully this video has been of some help to you. Feel free to leave a like and subscribe if it has. I have a number of different Sony camera and lens videos on this channel already that I would highly encourage you to check out, and there will certainly be many more on the way. For now, that is all I have to say, so thanks for watching.